I can still see it clearly, like it happened last night. The kitchen light was buzzing overhead, flickering against the pale yellow walls Daniel always said we didn't need to repaint. I had just come home from the bookstore, my arms full of something I thought would change my life. I placed my very first Harvard Law textbook on the counter. My heart was racing. I wanted him to see it, to be proud, maybe even to say I knew you could do it. He didn't. Daniel leaned back in his chair, beer bottle sweating in his hand. He looked at the book like it was a joke. Then he smirked. That smirk. It was small, almost lazy, but it cut deeper than any shout could have. He flipped through the pages with 2 fingers, as if the weight of the law was just another catalog of things we couldn't afford. Cute, he said finally, letting the book fall shut with a dull thud. What a waste of money. That was it. No fight, no storm, just that smirk, that careless laugh under his breath. I stood there trying not to blink too hard, because if I did, the tears would fall. My chest burned and I forced a smile, pretending his words hadn't found the softest part of me. Inside, though, something shifted. I realized I wasn't looking at my husband anymore. I was looking at my prison guard. That night, when the house went quiet, I lay awake beside him. His snore rattled the headboard, steady and oblivious. The clock on the nightstand ticked louder with every second. I stared at the ceiling, at the faint water stain in the corner, and I thought about how many dreams had died in this house. How many times I had believed him when he told me I wasn't enough. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who used to scribble essays late into the night, who dreamed of courtrooms and justice, who believed she could stand in front of any man and argue until her voice broke. That girl had gone quiet over the years. She had been smothered under dinners on the table by 6 bills stacked on the counter and Daniel's running commentary about how reality worked. But as I listened to his snore, something inside me cracked open. The silence of the room wasn't heavy anymore. It was sharp, alive, daring me to move. I got up, careful not to wake him, and padded into the kitchen. The textbook was still there on the counter, its spine uncreased, the glossy cover catching the faint light from the fridge. I ran my fingers over it, tracing the embossed letters. Harvard Law. My pulse picked up. For the first time in years, I felt like I was touching the future instead of just surviving the present. I opened the first page. The words blurred at first, my eyes still hot with unshed tears. But the more I read, the clearer they became. Definitions, cases, principles. It wasn't easy, but it was real. It was mine. I stayed there for hours, hunched over the counter, whispering the words under my breath like a prayer. When dawn crept in through the blinds, Daniel shuffled into the kitchen, scratching his chest, half asleep. He barely noticed me. "You're still up," he muttered, grabbing another beer from the fridge. The clock said 7 a.m. I nodded, my hand still resting on the book. He shrugged, opened the bottle, and left the room. No kiss, no good morning. Just a muttered, "Don't forget to pay the electric bill." And just like that, I knew. He would never see me. He would never believe in me. If I wanted to be something more, I would have to do it without him. That day, I carried the textbook with me everywhere. In the laundry room, while I folded shirts, in the car, while waiting at the grocery pickup, even on the back porch, when Daniel turned up the TV inside. Every insult he had ever thrown at me played on a loop in my head, but instead of breaking me, they started to sound like fuel. "You'll never make it. You're not smart enough. Lawyers aren't people like us." Every line was a challenge. That night, when I crawled back into bed, the book tucked safely under the covers beside me, I whispered into the dark. Not to him, but to myself. "You will." The words startled me. They felt like they came from that younger girl who had been buried for so long. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. I just whispered it again, steadier this time. "You will." And in that whisper, I felt something shift. I wasn't just a wife trying to please a husband who'd already decided my worth. I was a woman standing on the edge of something dangerous, something terrifying, and something unstoppable. The next morning, Daniel kissed my cheek on his way out the door. He didn't notice the dark circles under my eyes or the way my hand lingered on that heavy book. He didn't ask. He never did. But I knew. I knew that smirk had set something in motion. I knew I would never forgive it. And I knew one way or another, it was the beginning of the end. The morning after that night with the textbook, I could feel the weight of his smirk still sitting in my chest. Daniel had left for work, slamming the door behind him like he always did. I waited until I heard the sound of his truck fade down the street before pulling the textbook out from under the couch cushion where I had hidden it. My hands shook, not because I was afraid of the law, but because I was afraid of him finding it again. That was the rhythm of my life then: hide what mattered, show him what he wanted. Dinner on the table, bills stacked neatly, me smiling when I wanted to scream. But inside, something new was forming. That afternoon, while Daniel was gone, I sat at the computer and typed in LSAT prep classes near me. The results popped up and my stomach dropped. Each option felt like a door I wasn't supposed to open, but I clicked anyway. I found a night class at the community center 2 towns over. Cash only. No receipts. It felt like it was made for someone like me. I signed up. My hands were trembling, but not from fear, from adrenaline. When Daniel came home that night, I told him I was starting yoga. He barely looked up from his plate. "Maybe it'll make you less uptight," he said with a smirk. I forced a laugh, but inside I was on fire. He had no idea what kind of yoga I was about to practice. The first class was small, maybe 10 of us sitting in stiff metal chairs in a dimly lit room that smelled faintly of disinfectant. Our instructor was a woman in her 40s with sharp glasses and sharper questions. She handed out practice problems like they were weapons. At first, I fumbled through them, embarrassed by how much I had forgotten, but then something clicked. Logic games, reading comprehension, critical reasoning. The skills came back to me like embers reigniting. After class, she stopped me at the door. "You've got something," she said, tapping her stack of papers. "Don't waste it." Her words stayed with me all the way home. They were the opposite of Daniel's, simple, direct, but filled with belief. I hadn't realized how starved I was for that until she gave it to me. I got home late. Daniel was on the couch watching TV with the volume too loud. "How was yoga?" he asked, smirking without looking at me. "Good," I said softly. And for the first time, it wasn't a lie, just not the truth he thought he knew. The weeks that followed were a blur of double lives. By day, I played the dutiful wife. By night, I wrestled with logic puzzles and case studies. I'd sit in that classroom pen scratching furiously, while Daniel sat at home thinking I was stretching on a mat somewhere. The deception scared me, but it also thrilled me. Each time I chose myself over his expectations, I felt a piece of my old self return. One evening after class, the instructor called me aside. "We're forming a study group," she said. "I think you'd be a great addition." That's when I met Professor Hale. He wasn't teaching the LSAT class, he just happened to be there mentoring a few students who wanted to aim higher. He had salt and pepper hair, wore corduroy blazers that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and spoke in a calm, measured way that made you feel like every word mattered. He asked me what my goals were. I laughed, embarrassed. Just passing the LSAT would be a miracle. He studied me, then said, "You're sharper than you think. Don't sell yourself short." Those words cracked something open in me. They weren't flowery or emotional, but they were the opposite of everything I'd heard at home. For the first time in years, someone looked at me and saw possibility instead of failure. I went home that night buzzing with energy. Daniel was already in bed snoring. I crawled in beside him, my heart still racing from Hale's words. I whispered into the darkness, "I can do this." It felt like I was confessing a sin, but instead of guilt, I felt power. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I lived for the nights at the community center. I devoured practice tests, stayed up late into the night, scribbling answers in the margins of my textbooks. Daniel noticed me yawning more, but he chalked it up to all that stupid yoga. One night, while I was rinsing dishes, he came up behind me. "When are you gonna stop with this phase?" he asked casually. "You always get these ideas. Sewing, gardening, now yoga. None of them last. I didn't answer, I just kept scrubbing. But inside, I promised myself this one would. When LSAT day finally came, I lied again. I told Daniel I was volunteering at the community center. He waved me off, more interested in his football game. The test was brutal. Hours of silent scratch of pencils, the weight of every choice pressing down on me. But as I worked through the sections, I felt a strange calm. I was prepared. I belonged there. When I walked out of the testing center, the sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in the cool air. It felt like standing on the edge of something vast, terrifying, and exhilarating. Weeks later, when the score arrived, I opened the envelope with shaking hands. My eyes scanned the numbers. I gasped. It was higher than I had dared to hope. High enough for doors I had thought were closed forever. That night, Daniel noticed the envelope on the counter. "What's this?" he asked. I snatched it up quickly. "Junk mail," I said, shoving it into my bag. He didn't care enough to press further. I waited until he was asleep to pull it out again. I stared at those numbers until tears blurred my vision. Not tears of fear this time, tears of belief. I folded the letter, carefully slid it into my Harvard Law textbook, and pressed the cover shut. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was proof. For the first time in years, I believed in myself more than I feared him. The envelope was thicker than the usual bills and coupons that crowded our mailbox. White, heavy, official. When I saw the return address, my breath caught Harvard Law School admissions. My fingers trembled as I slid it free, glancing toward the house, as if Daniel might suddenly appear. He was inside, watching the game. The roar of the commentators bled through the windows. I stood there on the porch, clutching the envelope against my chest, my heartbeat louder than the TV. I couldn't open it there. Not with him inside, not with his smirk waiting for me if the letter said no. I slipped the envelope under my sweater, held it against my skin like it might burn a hole through me, and walked quickly down the block. At the corner coffee shop, I sat at a sticky table, the smell of burnt espresso clinging to the air. I tore the flap open with shaking hands. The words blurred at first, but then they came into focus. "We are pleased to inform you." I gasped so loudly the barista turned. I pressed my hand to my mouth, tears stinging my eyes. I had done it. Against every sneer, every late night, every whisper of doubt, I had done it. I wanted to run home and shout it, to wave the letter in Daniel's face and prove him wrong. But then I pictured his smirk, his laugh, the way he would twist this victory into something small, something silly. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it inside my textbook between 2 chapters of constitutional law. My secret, my proof. That evening, I cooked his favorite dinner pot roast with garlic mashed potatoes. I plated it neatly, poured him a drink, and waited. When he walked in, he tossed his jacket on the chair, kissed my cheek absently, and sat down. "How was yoga?" he asked, mouth full of food, before I could answer. "Fine," I said, keeping my voice steady. My hand brushed against the textbook hidden on the counter behind me. The letter slept inside like a heartbeat. He smirked. "You don't look any more flexible." He laughed at his own joke, shaking his head. I smiled thinly, swallowing the urge to tell him everything. Instead, I asked about his day. He droned on about the shop, about a supplier who hadn't paid on time, about the world always being unfair to him. I nodded, refilled his glass, and kept my secret safe. That night, while he snored beside me, I pulled the letter out again. The moonlight caught the embossed seal. I traced it with my fingertip, whispering the words over and over, "We are pleased to inform you." It was the first time in years I had something that was wholly mine. Not shared, not dismissed, not mocked. Mine. Days turned into weeks. I threw myself into preparations, immunizations, paperwork, housing forms, each task a thrill. I did it all in silence. When Daniel asked why I was up late at the computer, I told him I was looking up yoga routines. When he asked why I was driving across town, I told him I was trying a new class. One evening, I walked in from the post office clutching a packet of Harvard forms. Daniel looked up from the couch. "What's that?" he asked. "Recipes?" I lied, sliding the packet into my bag before he could reach for it. He chuckled, turning back to the TV. "Don't waste too much money on fancy cookbooks. You know I like things simple." I bit back a laugh. If only he knew. The day my official ID card arrived, I held it up to the light. My photo stared back at me, awkward but determined. Underneath Harvard Law School. I kissed it like it was a holy relic, then hid it inside the same textbook that now held the acceptance letter. The book grew heavy with secrets, but hiding came with its own weight. I began to notice the cracks forming between us. My silences stretched longer, my smiles more forced. Daniel noticed, though he misread it. "You're stressed," he said one night, patting my hand with mock concern. "That yoga stuff is making you tired. Maybe you should quit." I pulled my hand back gently. "Maybe I should keep going," I said softly. He frowned but didn't press. His silence was permission enough. The following weekend, I took the train into the city for an orientation session. I sat in a lecture hall with towering ceilings surrounded by strangers who all looked sharper, younger, richer than me. I felt out of place, small, until I pulled the acceptance letter from my folder and reminded myself I belong here. When I came home, Daniel asked no questions. He was too busy complaining about a late delivery at work. He didn't notice the glow in my eyes, the quiet confidence blooming inside me. That night, I placed the Harvard packet under my pillow. I slept deeply for the first time in years. For so long, his smirk had defined me. Now finally, I had something stronger, proof that I was more than his cage. And though he didn't know it yet, every day brought me closer to the moment he would see me, truly see me for the first time. Life became a balancing act, and every day felt like walking a tightrope strung high above an unseen drop. By daylight, I was Daniel's wife, folding laundry, paying bills, smiling when his coworkers came over for beers, nodding politely when they all laughed about women drivers or ladies who shop too much. But as soon as his world dimmed into sleep or TV static, mine lit up. My textbooks opened, my notes spread across the bed, and my laptop glowed like a portal into another life. The Harvard letter stayed tucked in the law book on the shelf, but it was more than paper now, it was a key I turned every night. Each time I cracked open those pages, I felt like I was unlocking a room in myself that he had nailed shut years ago. But double lives are heavy. Every secret made me sharper, yes, but also lonelier. I learned to disguise exhaustion with makeup, to explain long drives as visiting yoga studios, to slip tuition receipts into envelopes and hide them under the lining of my purse. I knew if Daniel ever discovered the truth, he would scorch it to the ground. One evening, while he sat in the living room watching football, I spread my books across our bed. The contrast made me want to laugh and cry at once, his world and mine colliding on the same mattress. Constitutional law notes pressed against the comforter, highlighters rolling into the pillows, my handwriting bleeding across margins. For a brief, dangerous moment, I imagined telling him, "Look, this is who I am now." But then his voice floated down the hallway. "Babe, grab me another beer." And just like that, the courage vanished. I closed the book, slid the papers under the comforter, and carried him what he wanted. That night, I lay awake listening to him snore, the scent of cheap beer clinging to the air. My stomach tightened. I reached beneath the mattress, pulled out my notes, and read by the faint light of my phone screen. Sleep became a stranger. I lived on coffee, adrenaline, and the flickering fuel of hope. The next morning, as I packed Daniel's lunch, my hands shook from exhaustion. He noticed, frowning as he buttoned his shirt. "You look terrible," he said, half amused. "Yoga's killing you. Maybe you should quit before you hurt yourself." I forced a laugh. Maybe. Inside, my thoughts screamed, "Quit. Never." Weeks later, my body gave me away. I fell asleep at the dinner table, my fork clattering against the plate. Daniel barked a laugh. "Guess yoga isn't making you a guru after all." He shook his head and went back to eating. I excused myself, retreated to the bathroom, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. Shadows pooled under my eyes, but I didn't see weakness. I saw someone changing, someone willing to pay the price. The tension stretched thinner with every passing day. One evening, as I scribbled case notes in the kitchen, Daniel walked in unexpectedly. His eyes narrowed at the open textbook. "What's this?" he asked, picking it up. My chest clenched. I reached for a lie. "It's just something from yoga. Philosophy readings." He chuckled, flipping through the dense legal jargon. "Philosophy. This is gibberish." He dropped the book back on the counter like it was trash. What a waste. The old me would have flushed, apologized, closed the book. Instead, I said nothing. I slid the text toward me, reopened it, and began highlighting again. My hands were steady. Daniel watched me for a moment, confusion flickering in his eyes. Then he shrugged, muttered whatever, and grabbed a beer. He didn't know it, but in that silence something shifted. For the first time, his dismissal didn't break me. It hardened me. The next day I walked into Professor Hale's office. He had become more than a mentor. He was my anchor, reminding me I wasn't crazy for wanting more. I closed the door behind me, leaned against the wood, and whispered, "I'm living two lives." He looked at me carefully. "And how long do you think you can keep that up?" The question lingered long after I left his office. I knew the answer, though I didn't want to face it. Secrets only hold for so long before they spill, and when mine did, it would change everything. That night, Daniel came home early. I hadn't expected him. My notes were still on the table, spread out in messy piles. His footsteps echoed down the hall, and panic surged through me. I shoved the papers into a drawer, slammed it shut, and plastered a smile on my face as he entered. "What's for dinner?" he asked, loosening his tie. His eyes darted to the drawer. "Pasta," I said quickly, moving to the stove. He shrugged, kicked off his shoes, and turned on the TV. I exhaled, my knees nearly buckling. The drawer rattled slightly from the rushed shove, as if the papers inside were straining to escape. Later that night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and whispered to myself, "Not much longer. Just hold on." Because deep down, I knew the truth. My double life was not a phase. It was the bridge to my freedom. It was in Professor Hale's class that I first felt like I could breathe without apology. The room was filled with people half my age, sharp voices ready to argue, but when I spoke, the air shifted. They listened. And Hale, he leaned forward, tapping his pen against his notepad, eyes fixed on me like my words were worth gold. "Excellent," he said once after I dissected a case no one else had touched correctly. Just one word, but it wrapped around me like armor. I walked out of that room glowing, clutching my notebook like a prize. The chill Boston wind bit at my cheeks, but I didn't care. For the first time, I believed I belonged here. But home was another world. When I arrived that evening, Daniel was sprawled across the couch, boots still on, TV blaring. My textbooks were on the counter where I'd left them, open to a page on constitutional interpretation. I froze. He must have noticed me staring because he smirked. "Oh, I saw your little books," he said, voice thick with amusement. "Didn't know yoga had homework." I held my breath. He reached over, picked up the top book, and without even flipping a page, dropped a takeout menu on top of it. "Here, this is more your speed. Why don't you pick dinner instead of pretending you're a lawyer?" He laughed, shook his head, and turned back to the game. I stood there, fists clenched so tight my nails bit into my palms. The sound of the TV roared in my ears, but underneath it something stronger pulsed. Rage. Not the kind that burned wild and reckless, but the kind that focused, sharpened, forged steel. I picked up the book, slid the menu off, and pressed the spine shut with deliberate care. He didn't even notice. Later that night I was still trembling, not with weakness, but with fire. His ridicule no longer landed the way it once did. Every insult was a brick, and I was stacking them into a wall that would one day tower over him. The next morning, I was back in Hale's classroom, eyes sharp, voice steady. I argued through a dense case like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. Hale smiled faintly, like he knew. After class, he pulled me aside. "You have a gift, Maya. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. I wanted to tell him everything about Daniel, about the lies, about the way my life at home was suffocating me. But I bit my tongue. Instead, I nodded and said, "Thank you." Walking home, I thought about how different the two worlds were. One where my words were dismissed with a menu, and one where my words could command a room. That evening, Daniel complained about bills. He grumbled about how much money I spent on groceries, how hard he worked compared to what I did all day. "I mean, come on," he said, gesturing toward my books. "How's any of that gonna help us pay the mortgage?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. If I told him the truth that one day I'd be the one paying for everything, that one day I'd out-earn him 100 times over, he'd laugh. So instead, I just smiled faintly and said, "You'll see." He didn't catch the edge in my voice. He never did. That night after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table, the house dark around me. I spread out my notes, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I scribbled until my fingers cramped, pushing past exhaustion fueled by anger and determination. Each page I filled felt like a victory, each highlighted line a small rebellion. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I paused, pen hovering, and whispered to myself, "One day you'll know. One day you'll choke on those words." The silence of the kitchen seemed to nod back at me like it agreed. The day it all snapped began like any other, or at least it pretended to. I brewed coffee, stacked bills neatly by the toaster, and tucked my notes into the inside pocket of my tote bag. Daniel sat at the table, scrolling his phone, grunting at headlines, sipping beer, though it was barely noon. I had just grabbed my keys when his voice cut through the air. "Maya," he said, low and sharp. "Come here." Something in his tone made my stomach clench. He was holding an envelope, pale, official, the kind you never wanted him to notice. A tuition statement printed in bold. "What the hell is this?" His eyes were narrowed, his face already flushed. I opened my mouth, closed it again. My heart hammered against my ribs. "You've been lying to me!" He shoved the paper across the table, jabbing a finger at the numbers. "Do you see this? Do you see how much money you're wasting?" Yoga." His voice cracked into a laugh that wasn't laughter at all. "You said yoga. And all this time it's law school, Harvard. Do you think you're smarter than me? Do you think you're better?" I felt the walls of the kitchen closing in. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked too loud. Daniel's smirk twisted into a snarl. He grabbed the textbook from my tote, flipping it open. His fingers tore across the pages, careless, angry. Then with a sudden snap, he ripped the spine in half. Paper fluttered to the floor like wounded birds. "This," he spat, holding the ruined pieces, "is nothing. You'll never be a lawyer. You'll never make a dime off this crap." For years those words would have gutted me. For years I would have cried, begged, promised to stop. But as I looked at the shredded pages on the linoleum, something shifted. Instead of breaking, I hardened. Slowly, calmly, I bent down and picked up a torn page. The text was still legible, even in fragments. I pressed it flat on the counter, smoothed the wrinkles with steady fingers. "You can tear the book," I said softly, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "But you can't touch what's in my head." He froze, beer bottle dangling in his hand. He wasn't used to me talking back. "What did you just say?" I met his eyes, and for the first time, I didn't flinch. "You heard me." The silence stretched between us, thick and sharp. Finally, he scoffed, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out the door, slamming it so hard the frame rattled. I stood there alone, breathing hard, hands shaking. The torn pages still scattered across the floor like confetti from a battle I hadn't planned to fight. And then I moved. I went to the bedroom, pulled open the drawer where my secrets lived. Beneath a stack of folded sweaters, I retrieved the envelope I'd tucked away months ago. Divorce papers, signed but unsent. I held them in my hands, the weight heavier than any textbook. For weeks I had told myself they were insurance, a someday choice. But now, staring at the wreckage of my book, at the echo of his rage still vibrating in the walls, I knew someday was today. I placed the papers on the counter right where the textbook had been. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, his destruction beside my liberation. That night when he returned, he didn't mention the outburst. He acted as though nothing had happened. But I did. I had changed. I cooked dinner, washed dishes, nodded at his stories. But inside I was elsewhere. My mind traced every line of those papers. Every word was a key, a map out of the cage. When he finally fell asleep, sprawled across the bed, I slipped into the kitchen. I ran my fingers over the papers, my decision echoing louder than his snores. For years, I had been afraid of him discovering my secret. Now I realized he already had, and he couldn't stop me. Because I wasn't just studying law anymore. I was preparing to use it. The morning I left didn't look like the morning of a revolution. The sun rose the same way, weak light spilling through the kitchen blinds. Daniel snored in the bedroom, beer bottles still littered the coffee table. To an outsider, it was an ordinary Saturday. But inside me, it was the end. I had packed the night before. Just 2 suitcases tucked into the closet behind old coats. Clothes, a few books, my laptop, and the envelope with divorce papers. Everything else, wedding photos, his furniture, the china we never used, I left behind. When the truck horn blared outside, my pulse spiked. The driver, a college kid I'd hired through a flyer, leaned out the window. "You, Maya." "Yes." My voice shook, but only once. I wheeled the suitcases through the living room. Daniel stirred in the bedroom but didn't wake. The sound of the zipper bumping across the floor felt deafening. I half expected him to appear to block the door, to smirk that smirk and call me pathetic. But the bedroom door stayed shut. When I stepped onto the porch, the air hit me different. Crisp, alive. I loaded the bags into the truck, climbed in, and didn't look back until we turned the corner. The house shrank in the rearview mirror, and with it the cage I'd called a marriage. The ride to campus was quiet. I stared out the window, my mind replaying every insult, every dismissal. His voice hissed in my memory. "You'll never make it. You're not smart enough. What a waste." Each word felt smaller now, like echoes in a tunnel I was walking out of. When we pulled up to the student housing complex, I almost laughed. It was nothing glamorous. A squat brick building, paint-peeling windows fogged. Students hauled boxes up stairwells, voices carrying. It smelled faintly of pizza and dust. But to me, it was freedom. I dragged my suitcases up 2 flights of stairs to a tiny dorm room. White walls, a single bed with a thin mattress, a desk barely big enough for a laptop. I ran my hand over the chipped wood, smiling. It wasn't much, but it was mine. That night I sat cross-legged on the bed, textbooks stacked beside me, laptop glowing. Outside, the subway roared, rattling the window. Instead of annoying me, the sound made me feel safe. It was the soundtrack of the city, the heartbeat of a place that didn't know me as Daniel's wife. Here I was, just Maya. Still, the silence inside the room pressed heavy. For the first time in years, there was no snoring beside me, no clink of bottles, no mocking laugh. Just me. I pulled my knees to my chest and let the tears come, not because I regretted leaving, but because freedom felt lonely. I cried until the subway roared again, reminding me I wasn't alone. Out there, thousands of lives were moving, pulsing, fighting for space, and now I was one of them. The next morning I woke to sunlight streaming through the blinds. I made instant coffee in a chipped mug, sat at the desk and opened my notes. No interruptions, no ridicule, just silence, the good kind. I worked for hours, my pen flying, my mind sharp. For the first time, I felt what it meant to be fully present in my own life. Every paragraph I read, every case I outlined, felt like bricks laid in a foundation that was finally mine. Later that week, I mailed the divorce papers. I stood at the post office counter, pen in hand, signing the last line with a flourish that surprised me. My hand didn't shake. My chest didn't tighten. It felt like cutting a rope I'd been tied to for too long. As the clerk stamped the envelope and slid it into the outgoing tray, I whispered, "Goodbye." That night I returned to my dorm, collapsed on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The room was still small, still lonely. But my chest was light. For the first time in years, I slept without fear of the door slamming, without dread of the smirk waiting in the kitchen. The subway roared outside my window, and I dreamed not of escape, but of beginnings. The first week in student housing was a blur of cardboard boxes, orientation schedules, and late-night study marathons. I learned the rhythm of my new life: wake up in a cramped dorm room, grab coffee that tasted like burnt tar, sprint to class, and collapse back into my bed with case briefs scattered around me. And for the first time, I felt alive. Still, loneliness shadowed me. Even freedom has its price. The subway roared outside at night, a comfort, but inside the room the silence pressed heavy. No Daniel, no smirk, no ridicule, but also no one at all. Then came Hale. It was a Tuesday afternoon lecture on criminal procedure. The classroom buzzed with voices, students eager to prove themselves. I kept my head down, scribbling notes furiously. When the professor asked about due process, hands shot up like fireworks. Mine stayed down. "Ms. Rivera," he said, suddenly scanning the roster. My heart stopped, heads turned, heat flooded my face. "Yes. What do you think the framers intended in this section?" I swallowed. My notes blurred. A dozen eyes burned holes in me. For a moment, Daniel's voice whispered, "You'll never make it. You'll embarrass yourself." But another voice, smaller, steadier, whispered back, "You will." I raised my hand, slow but certain. I spoke, my voice trembling at first, then strengthening with each word. I pulled threads from the case, wove them into an argument, and when I finished, the room was silent. Then Hale smiled. "Excellent analysis." The words hit me like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Simple, direct. But in them was belief. After class, he stopped me in the hallway. "You've got instincts most students don't develop for years. Don't hide in the back row. You belong up front." I nodded, stunned. Walking back to my dorm, I replayed his words over and over. They echoed louder than every insult Daniel had ever thrown. That night, I sat at my desk until dawn, cases spread wide, highlighters bleeding color across pages. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Every line I read felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Days turned into weeks. Hale noticed me again and again. He asked me to help lead a study group. He pushed me to apply for internships I thought were out of reach. Each time I hesitated. Each time he looked me squarely in the eye and said, "You can do this." And slowly I started to believe him. One evening after class, I lingered to ask a question. Hale leaned against his desk, listening intently. When I finished, he set down his pen and said, "Maya, you remind me of myself when I was starting out. Rough edges but fire underneath. Don't let anyone smother it." His words lodged deep. I thought of Daniel, the years of smirks, the shredded textbook, the endless dismissal. He had tried to smother me. And now here was Hale doing the opposite, stoking the flame. Walking home through the chill, I wrapped my coat tighter and whispered, "I won't." The subway roared beneath my feet, not as noise this time, but as anthem. That weekend, I visited the library. Marble floors, endless stacks, the scent of old books and ambition. I found a quiet corner, spread my notes, and worked until my hands cramped. Around me, students whispered, typed, lived their own battles. For the first time, I felt part of something larger than myself. Back in my dorm, I pinned Hale's words above my desk on a scrap of paper. "Don't let anyone smother it." Every time exhaustion threatened, I looked at those words. They pulled me forward. Weeks later, Hale recommended me for a legal clinic. It was unpaid, grueling, and terrifying, and I said yes. I sat across from clients with stories heavier than mine, and for the first time I realized law wasn't just about me proving Daniel wrong. It was about giving voice to people who had been silenced too. That night, lying in bed, I thought, maybe this is bigger than revenge. Maybe this is about purpose. Still, in quiet moments, Daniel's shadow returned. His laugh, his smirk, the rip of paper. But now those memories fueled me instead of breaking me. Because I had found someone who saw me. Someone who believed. And more importantly, I had started to believe myself. The black robe hung heavy on my shoulders, stiffer than I expected, its folds brushing against my calves with each step. I adjusted the square cap on my head, feeling ridiculous and glorious at the same time. My name was pinned on a white card, Maya Rivera, printed in bold proof that I belonged here. The auditorium buzzed with energy. Families filled the rows, waving signs, snapping pictures, calling out names. Graduates clustered in groups, hugging laughing eyes wet with pride. I stood near the back, scanning the sea of faces. Some parents held bouquets. Others clutched cameras with trembling hands. The air smelled like perfume and popcorn, sweet and nervous. My stomach tightened. There was no one in the crowd for me, no waving hand, no camera flashing when I walked by. Daniel hadn't come. I hadn't even invited him. What would have been the point? He would have smirked through the whole ceremony, muttered about pomp and circumstance, and told me I looked silly in a robe. So instead, I carried myself. Alone, but not lonely. The ceremony dragged, speeches piling on speeches, words about justice, truth, perseverance. I half listened, half drifted into memory. The kitchen smirk, the shredded textbook, the subway roars outside my dorm, Hale's quiet encouragement, each image lined up like a slideshow of how far I'd come. Finally, they began calling names. Applause thundered with each graduate who crossed the stage. My heart pounded as the alphabet crept closer to R. Rivera Maya. The words echoed in the vast hall. My feet moved before I knew it. I climbed the steps, my breath shallow, the lights hot on my face. When the dean placed the diploma in my hands, time slowed. The parchment was heavier than it looked, embossed with the seal of Harvard Law. I clutched it, felt the weight of every sleepless night, every whispered vow, every tear shed in silence. The applause blurred. I searched the crowd instinctively, looking for someone, anyone to lock eyes with. For a moment, loneliness stung. But then I realized the silence in my corner of the hall wasn't emptiness. It was strength. No one was there to smirk, to dismiss, to steal this moment. The victory was mine alone. I walked down the steps, head-high, robe swaying. My heels clicked against the stage floor, each sound a punctuation mark. Back in my seat, I ran my fingers over the diploma. My chest ached, but not from sadness. From release. The silence beside me wasn't a void. It was space I had carved out with grit and fury, space I intended to fill with a life of my own making. When the ceremony ended, clusters of families swarmed the lawn. Graduates posed with parents, siblings, friends. Hale found me in the crowd, shook my hand firmly. "I'm proud of you, Maya," he said. Tears burned my eyes, but I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled, clutching the diploma against my chest. "Thank you," I whispered. That night back in my dorm, I slid the diploma into a frame I had bought weeks earlier. I propped it on the desk right above Hale's note, "Don't let anyone smother it." Then, almost ceremonially, I pulled out the divorce decree. It had been finalized just days before. I laid it beside the diploma. 2 documents, one closing a door, one opening a world. I stared at them for a long time, listening to the subway roar outside my window. Daniel's absence wasn't a wound anymore. It was proof. He wasn't part of my victory because he'd never believed I could win. And standing there in the silence, I knew this. I didn't need him to see me. I saw myself now. The first time I stood in court as more than a spectator, I thought I would crumble under the weight of it. The ceiling soared overhead, lined with carved wood and echoes of history. The judge sat high above us, robed dark gavel, resting like a threat and a promise. My palms slicked with sweat as I shuffled my notes, but beneath the fear was a current of fire. This wasn't Daniel's kitchen. This wasn't the couch where he'd mocked my dreams. This was my arena. It was a small case, a tenant fighting a crooked landlord who had been overcharging for heat. On paper, it wasn't glamorous. But to me, it was Everest. If I stumbled here, I'd tumble down the mountain I'd spent years climbing. When the judge called my name, I rose. My heart hammered, but my voice came out clear. "Your Honor." The arguments tumbled from me, shaky at first, then steady, then sharp. Each objection answered each point, clarified every statute wielded like a blade I had sharpened in secret for years. The opposing counsel sneered, older and seasoned, but I didn't break. I remembered every time Daniel had called me pathetic, every time he laughed at my silly books. His voice hissed in my mind, "You'll never make it," and I hurled it back at him with every sentence I spoke. By the time I finished, silence filled the room. The judge leaned back, considering. Then he nodded. Motion granted. I almost couldn't breathe. The tenant gripped my hand, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. I wanted to tell her she had no idea what this meant, not just for her but for me. That her gratitude wasn't just for winning a case but for proving a life wrong. Instead, I squeezed her hand and smiled. Outside the courthouse, the city air was cold, but I felt electric. My heels clicked against the stone steps like a victory drum. People bustled past, unaware that a battle had been won, unaware that a woman once mocked into silence had just claimed her voice in full. That night, I returned to my apartment, not a dorm anymore, but a tiny studio I rented with my first paycheck. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, but the silence was mine. I poured a glass of cheap champagne, raised it to the air, and whispered to the courtroom. The bubbles burned down my throat, sweet and sharp. I sat at the desk, diploma framed above me, Hale's note pinned beside it. For the first time I saw myself not as the woman who had been underestimated, but as the lawyer I had fought to become. And yet beneath the triumph there was something darker, hunger. One victory wasn't enough. I wanted more. I wanted every smirk, every insult, every laugh that had tried to shrink me. I wanted them answered with gavel strikes and verdicts in my favor. The courtroom wasn't just where I worked now, it was where I avenged myself. Weeks later I won again. And again. Each case built on the last, stacking like bricks into a fortress of proof. My name began to circulate, Rivera, sharp, relentless, precise. I felt Daniel shrinking further into the past with each whispered compliment, each handshake from a client, each nod from a judge. One evening, as I walked out of court, the golden sunset spilling across the steps, I caught my reflection in the glass doors. Black suit, steady eyes, mouth set in determination. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. This wasn't the woman who once whispered, "You will," in the dark, clutching a book like a lifeline. This was the woman who had. I smiled at my reflection, then turned heels, clicking, already hungry for the next case. Success has a strange way of filling silence. Where there used to be the echo of Daniel's smirk, there was now the hum of phones buzzing with new clients, the shuffle of papers across my desk, the quiet pride of strangers who called me Attorney Rivera. I rented a better apartment, still modest, but with tall windows and a sliver of skyline. I bought myself a second-hand Mercedes, the kind of car Daniel used to laugh at when he saw women driving alone. Each small step felt like reclaiming oxygen. But while my world rose, his began to crumble. It started with whispers. At lunch one afternoon, Hale mentioned casually, "Didn't your ex's name come up in the news? Something about financial trouble?" I blinked. My ex? Yes. Daniel Rivera, right? I saw a headline. Construction business debts piling up. For a moment, my fork froze halfway to my mouth. The cafeteria noise faded. I hadn't spoken his name in months, maybe years. It felt strange hearing it out loud, like dust blown off an old box you thought you'd burned. I shrugged lightly, hiding the flicker of electricity in my chest. We haven't spoken in a long time. That night, curiosity gnawed at me. I typed his name into Google, half dreading, half eager. And there it was, articles about Rivera Construction facing lawsuits, workers' unpaid creditors circling. His smug face in old photos now paired with words like fraud, foreclosure, bankruptcy. I stared at the screen, pulse racing. I should have felt pity. Instead, I felt something sharper, justice. This was the man who once told me I'd never make it, who tore my books, who smirked at every dream. Now he was unraveling, and I was thriving. Days later, the universe twisted the knife. A new case file landed on my desk. Tenant versus Rivera Construction. My breath caught at the name. I scanned the details. Daniel's company had botched a housing project, left families in mold-infested apartments, then refused repairs. I laughed, a sound half bitter, half victorious. Of all the cases of all the firms, it landed on mine. When I told Hale, he arched an eyebrow. Fate has a sense of humor. I nodded, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. Or vengeance. Preparing the case felt surreal. Every document, every complaint was another reminder of the man who once ruled my life with dismissive words. Only now his power was paper thin. He was the defendant. I was the one armed with evidence and law. At night, I spread the files across my desk the way I once spread textbooks across my bed. But the feeling was different now. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't sneaking. I was sharpening my sword in plain sight with the world watching. One evening, I sat by the window, city lights flickering like fireflies, and whispered, "You said I'd never make it." I lifted the case file, heavy and damning. "Watch me bury you in court." For the first time, I wanted him to see me, not because I needed his validation, but because I wanted him to choke on the sight. The courthouse felt different that morning. I'd been here dozens of times, argued in front of this same judge, crossed paths with seasoned attorneys. But this case, the name on the docket, made the walls hum with something personal. Rivera Construction versus Tenants. The surname carved across the file wasn't just a client's enemy. It was mine. I walked through security, heels clicking on marble. My suit was pressed, my hair pinned neatly, my case file tucked under my arm. Outwardly, I looked composed. Inside, my heart thundered, not with fear, but with anticipation. When I stepped into the courtroom, he was already there. Daniel. Older, heavier, his once cocky posture slumped. The swagger I remembered had dulled, but his eyes, those sharp, dismissive eyes, still tried to pierce me. For a second, the years folded back. I was standing in the kitchen again, holding a textbook while he smirked. But then I blinked and the scene dissolved. He wasn't holding power anymore. He was clutching at it. And I was the one armed with law, precedent, and truth. He noticed me and smirked anyway, though it faltered. "Maya," he muttered as I passed. I didn't answer. I set my files on the table, spine straight, gaze forward. Silence was my reply. The proceedings began. His attorney, a man slick with charm but thin on substance, rose first, spinning excuses about cost overruns and unforeseen challenges. I listened, pen poised, each falsehood landing like a stone in my palm, something I could hurl back when it was my turn. When the judge nodded to me, I stood. My voice didn't shake. "Your Honor, the evidence will show." I laid out photographs of cracked ceilings, testimony from families living with mold, invoices unpaid, each exhibit stacked into a tower of failure. With every document entered, I could feel Daniel shrinking. He shifted in his seat, jaw tight. His smirk disappeared. At one point, the judge asked Ms. Rivera, "How do you respond to the claim of unforeseen circumstances?" I paused. The silence stretched. Years ago, I would have rushed to fill it, afraid of looking weak. Now I let it breathe. The quiet pressed down, commanding the room. Everyone leaned in. Then I spoke, steady, sharp. The only thing unforeseen here was how long these tenants would endure negligence. The law is clear. The gavel tapped once. The judge nodded. Daniel's eyes burned into me, but he couldn't stop the tide. Evidence piled. Witnesses testified. His attorney sputtered. I remained calm, my silence more cutting than any insult I could throw. When closing arguments arrived, I stood tall. For years, these families have been ignored. Promises made, promises broken. But silence doesn't erase responsibility. Today, the law speaks for them. I sat down. The judge deliberated, then delivered the ruling. Motion in favor of the tenants. Judgment against Rivera Construction. The words rang like a bell. Final, irrevocable. Daniel slumped, face pale. His attorney muttered something about appeals, but it was hollow. The gavel came down, and with it years of smirks, laughs, and shredded pages. I gathered my files slowly, deliberately. As I passed him, Daniel whispered, "You think you've won?" I stopped, turned my head slightly. For a heartbeat, our eyes locked. Then I said nothing. The silence cut deeper than words ever could. Outside, the sky was wide and clear, the city alive with noise. I stood at the top of the courthouse steps, breathing it in. Around me, clients hugged, reporters buzzed, but I heard only the silence inside me, no longer heavy, no longer lonely. It was victory. The elevator hummed quietly as it rose, glass panels, revealing the sprawl of Manhattan glittering beneath me. Skyscrapers stabbed at the skylights, flickering like constellations. My reflection stared back in the polished steel, sleek black dress hair, swept into an elegant knot expression. Calm. When the elevator doors slid open, the penthouse stretched before me. High ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, marble floors glowing under recessed lights. A space so vast, so gleaming, it almost mocked the cramped dorm room where I once whispered promises to myself in the dark. I stepped inside, heels clicking against stone, and pulled the key from my purse. Heavy golden embossed with the building's crest. For a moment I just held it in my palm, feeling its weight. Years ago I clutched a shredded textbook. Now I clutched proof of a life rebuilt from ashes. I set the key on the counter beside a crystal decanter of champagne. Then I walked slowly through each room, letting the silence wrap around me. But this silence wasn't suffocating like Daniel's kitchen or the hollow nights of my dorm. This silence was expansive, chosen, mine. The living room overlooked Central Park, trees dark against the city lights. I pressed my hand to the glass, breath fogging faintly, and thought about the girl I used to be. The one who believed she was only a wife, who measured herself by Daniel's smirks and shrugs. I whispered to her, "You made it." The Benz was parked downstairs in the private garage. The bank account, swollen with case fees and investments, sat secure. But it wasn't the money or the marble or the skyline that struck me hardest. It was the fact that I had written this ending myself. On the mantel above the fireplace, I had placed two frames side by side. In one, my Harvard law diploma. In the other, the divorce decree. Two documents, two battles, two victories. Every time I looked at them, I felt the circle close. Later, as the city quieted, I poured myself a glass of champagne and stood on the balcony. The wind tugged at my dress, carrying the sounds of sirens and laughter and horns below. I raised the glass high. To silence, I whispered. Because silence had been my cage, then my companion, and finally my weapon. In court and life, I had learned how to wield it, to let it speak louder than Daniel ever could. I imagined him somewhere smaller now, his empire crumbled, his voice fading into irrelevance. Maybe he still smirked. Maybe he still muttered that I'd never succeed. But it didn't matter. I wasn't listening anymore. The only sound was the city and my own heartbeat, steady, strong. I sipped, letting the bubbles burn sweet on my tongue. The key lay gleaming on the counter inside. And as I turned back toward the penthouse, my penthouse, I knew this was more than revenge. This was a rival. The girl who once whispered, "You will," in the dark, had kept her promise. And now, standing tall above the city, I whispered back, "You did."